Great. So one of the benefits of argument mapping is that then you can see what's at stake, what's being deployed in the argument, what are the commitments that the author has introduced, how does the author consider objections, etc. And considering objections is a big part of what the skill we'll develop as critical thinkers. So let's turn now to your analysis then of Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality paper. I'd like you to take a look at your own argument map for that paper if you've developed one. If you haven't, then that's something you might want to do. And we'll look at some lines of objection that arise naturally on consideration of a completed argument map for the paper. And then what we're going to do is try to determine whether or not he has satisfactorily answered those objections. Let's take a look. So here's his general principle, right? So this is the governing principle of the argument. If it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, I suppose of equal moral importance, then we ought morally to do it. So this is his guiding principle, quoted from the paper. So our first question might be, why should I accept this? And so we've seen that he introduces some premises like, well, look, suffering is bad and we ought to prevent it when we can, etc. But we might wonder, a natural first response from a 21st century American might be, well, why should I sacrifice when other people don't sacrifice? So he addresses this to some extent. So remember, this is the sub-argument, which has to do with the fact that your moral responsibility is not discharged given other people having the same moral responsibility. So he does answer that kind of an objection. So just because other people have the same moral responsibility as you, conceptually it's clear, doesn't mean that you don't have that moral responsibility. That would be a straightforwardly self-contradictory claim. So he does answer an objection like that. You're still obliged to perform your duties even though other people might have the same duties. So strictly speaking, he does answer that objection. We might have practical concerns. This would be another sort of natural reaction to a paper like this. Well, how can I trust that charitable organizations can achieve their stated goals? Well, and this seems to be a reasonable worry. So we need reliable measures of efficiency and effectiveness. Now, I'm happy to say in our time we do have such measures. So there are many very good independent agencies or organizations that evaluate the effectiveness and efficiency of charitable organizations. You can do the research for yourself to find some, but for example, givewell.org, I believe, if I'm remembering it correctly, might be such an authority that you could go and investigate for yourself. So while he doesn't answer that objection, you might fill in that response for him. So that would be maybe a gap in his argument that you could complete for him. So this again has to do with our principle of reading in a charitable way. Here's another slightly more abstract or general, but I think also a sort of naturally arising worry. You might say, well, look, what if, because of, let's say, unforeseen consequences of my action, the whole general situation is worsened? Or let's say, even more concretely, let's say, for example, my charitable donations encourage some encourage the sort of disastrous circumstances in the economy of the recipient country, etc., such that things get even worse, or the country slips into war or dependency, etc. Now, does Singer answer that kind of an objection? Well, presumably built into his principle, if we return to his principle up here, he's kind of assuming that all things being equal, our action will have good consequences. So obviously he can't anticipate all possible consequences, but he's saying, given all things being equal, given that our charitable donation results in good outcomes, then we ought to do it. Now, of course, you might say, well, that's simply begging the question. So maybe this is a good objection. Maybe there's something here going on. Another possible line of objection would be, well, look, what if there are other ways to achieve these good ends? So let's say we take it to an extreme and say, if we all lived this way, if we all sort of engaged in this kind of charitable donation practice, then, we wouldn't teach our children to play the piano, we wouldn't engage in, there'd be no fashion, there'd be no artistic production, other very valuable, in different ways, endeavors would be lost because we'd be spending our time earning money in order to give the money to charity. And it might be the case that there are other ways for us to achieve these good ends that don't sacrifice, let's say, artistic production or poetry or literature, etc. It might be the case, for example, that certain trading arrangements, certain taxing arrangements might lead to the good ends that we hope for. So, for example, there is some evidence to support the idea that increases in free trade have had a positive effect on the on poverty levels during the last decade or so. It might be the case that free trade is a better solution to the suffering of people in the poorer parts of the world than charitable donation. I'm not sure. That's an empirical question. We'd have to consider it carefully and look at the evidence involved. But what if there are other ways for us to achieve these good ends? Then does this affect Singer's argument? Finally, we might also consider this point about proximity. So remember, in the case of the child drowning in the pool, it seemed to be a sort of an abominable, a horrible thing to do, to just leave the child drown when you could go in, sacrificing your sneakers, let's say, and save the child for a relatively small investment of energy and resources. By analogy, then he says, well, why is that child different from a child who's 10 miles away or 1,000 miles away or 5,000 miles away? And there seemed to be no morally relevant reason to prefer the child who was closer than the child who was far away, given similar expenditure of resources. But are there no morally good reasons to prefer people who are closer to me, to us? So, for example, there might be morally relevant reasons to prefer one's own children or family members over others. So there might be good moral reasons to prefer to attend to and feed one's own children over the children of one's neighbors. So there might be something beneficial that we wouldn't want to lose in the parent-child relationship that would rest on our preferential treatment of our own children over other people's children. Is there something similar with, let's say, loyalty to fellow citizens that we wouldn't want to give up? Well, that's a difficult question. I'd leave that for you to consider. So in closing then, what we're going to do is once we have the argument map in place, we'll consider objections. So by considering objections, one sort of easy strategy is to go through and negate various parts of the author's argument. So you could just go in and say why. You could point to some claim that he or she makes, and you could assert the opposite and consider what it would mean to deny the assertion or the premise or the inference. But that's probably enough for now.